ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you Mr. Will Wright.
Has everybody been drinking?
Yeah!
Good. I don't think I've ever given a talk to a drunk audience before. Nor have I ever given a talk while drunk. So it might work out okay. So if we could switch to my slides now. I kind of know what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. And I tend to be calling these things worlds. Now, really, when we talk about entertainment things that we make, that we really want to make big, across multiple properties, there are a lot of different terms that I come across. Franchise, brands, properties, but they all have kind of the wrong connotations to me when I think about these. You know, when I think franchise, I think fast food. When I think brand, I think you're trying to market something by association with somebody's label. And property feels like real estate to me, although probably the most common term that we're starting to use now is intellectual property, which even has kind of weirder connotations. But when I think about the properties that I really enjoy, the kind of worlds that really capture my imagination, that's what they really feel like. They are worlds. They come alive kind of in my mind. And I think that's what we want to aspire to make as game creators, or at least launch in game franchises. Something like Star Wars is interesting in that it actually is this kind of fractal-like thing. So the stories are on a fractal-like timeline. We have like the major movies that were made. Then we have books kind of filling in the interstices here. And then we have other products that kind of slowly fill out this whole world of Star Wars. You know, in Star Wars, we have these very strong archetypes. We have kind of these elaborate settings and places, locations. And we have kind of cool toys, technologies, and abilities that the characters have. But they're not our reality. And that's what makes it interesting, is it shares a lot in common with our reality, but there's some really interesting differences. And a lot of these worlds kind of, it's the differences that make them interesting. Like a world where a professor can make a radio out of coconuts, but can't fix a hole in a boat. Right? Or one in which vigilante justice is celebrated by the populace. Or faster than light travel is possible. Some of them, it's the limitations in these worlds that make them interesting, or really make them what they are. Grand Theft Auto, it's trivial to go out and carjack anybody, whereas Doors present this insurmountable challenge. So we all kind of have this one reality we live in, you know, in most cases, unless we're kind of deeply into meditation, or have brain damage, or kind of engaging in recreational drugs. But stories and games actually kind of give us alternate worlds to kind of go live parts of our lives in. In some sense, these things come alive in our imagination. You know, it's not just the experience you have watching Star Wars or Harry Potter, but it's kind of what you think about afterwards. It's the fact that you've downloaded that in your mind, and now there's a separate little alternate world living in your imagination. Sometimes we kind of do these things for escapism. There's a great book by Philip K. Dick called The Three Stigmata of Homer Elridge. And he describes this Martian colony where life is hell, and it's this horrible, horrible existence for these Martian colonists. So what they do after they work every day is they come in and they take these drugs that he calls Candy, and then they play with these little Barbie sets called Perky Pat. And the drug makes them transform into the doll set. They totally believe that they're the dolls, and they were basically living out the suburban existence on Earth through this doll set while on drugs. And in some sense, that's a lot of what we do in games, is we give people kind of that ability to project themselves into these worlds. Now we've seen a lot of these worlds launched in different formats, in books, radio, TV, movies, and games now. We're actually seeing a lot of very large franchises kind of coming out of the gaming world, being launched there initially, not being borrowed from movies like movies. I did a quick Google search of some of like the worlds that I've experienced, and this is just how many hits in millions that I found on Google against these properties. And it's kind of interesting that game properties stack up quite well. Of course, it's probably a little bit overrepresented audience being on the internet and all that, but still, the size of these franchises relative to mainstream entertainment is roughly equivalent. In some sense, I've been thinking about all the different components in which these worlds can kind of exist. And I've been thinking about the three different areas in which they kind of manifest themselves. There's kind of the story element down here where we get things like books, comics, movies, TV. Play, which is kind of the stuff that we tend to specialize in. And then branding. And by branding, I mean personal identity branding, where somebody kind of like wears a t-shirt or carries, a lunchbox and puts a poster up in their room. And basically, they're associating themselves with that brand. Things like music and web are kind of at the interstices of all these things. Now, if you look at something like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, this is kind of like a textbook example. It started out as a comic book, then went to collectibles, high-end collectibles, then became a TV show that was marketed with toys. Eventually, it kind of filled out almost all these things. And typically, these things happen like that, where they launch in one property, and then they tend to spread out and diffuse to the rest. Care Bears is kind of an interesting example because it wasn't really a mainstream start. It actually started as a line of greeting cards. And they were so successful as greeting cards that eventually they started making plush figures. And then they started a TV show, and educational products, board games. They made a movie, and then bondage devices for little kids or whatever. When we did The Sims, it was kind of interesting because it was always an experiment. At the very beginning, it's like we had no idea what this thing would do. And we never really thought that it would become a mainstream thing, like a franchise, as I'm talking about here. We did The Sims, and it did very well, so we came out with an expansion pack, and that did very well, and we started doing a few more expansion packs, and each one sold more than the last, and so we kept making them. And then we started doing online versions, then we did console versions, and The Sims 2, and then we did some more expansion packs, and. To be honest, I actually got tired of cutting and pasting these images, so I stopped. So EA was actually always behind The Sims. This is kind of to dispel an urban myth that EA was trying to crush it. Actually, it was Maxis that was giving a lot of resistance to developing The Sims. But EA, the executives were always behind it. But yet the publishing group still didn't know what to do with it. And so their lifetime franchise worldwide forecast was 300K units. And it's actually done substantially better than that. It's now one of the 4 kind of groups within EA. So as we're working on Spore now, I've been trying to kind of go about it very differently in terms of thinking about this as a franchise from the very beginning. If we knew this was going to be a franchise and we wanted to spread it out to all these different properties, how should we think about this? And so I don't know what Spore is going to sell eventually, but I think the way we're approaching it represents kind of a new way of thinking about IP and these worlds. Now, there's a tremendous amount of noise out there in the world of brands, entertainment properties, etc., that you're competing with. A lot of people are actually kind of identifying themselves with these brands, for the things like they wear. It used to be the thing was lunchbox. Lunchboxes were a big industry, and kids would bring these little metal lunchboxes, and that was kind of their favorite property. It might be the Lone Ranger, or it might be the Shadow, or whatever. Nowadays it's more likely to be a t-shirt or something. But people use this to triangulate who they are. I'm a big Star Wars fan, or I love Battlestar Galactica. And it kind of says something about them as a person. There's an association with brands. When AT&T changed their corporate logo, everybody applauded them as honesty in advertising because they chose the Death Star as their corporate logo. But then later, it turns out we discovered that Iapetus around Saturn was actually what it was representing. Now, most of these properties share a lot of things. If you compare them all, typically they have very strong archetypes or characters in them. They occur in interesting, elaborate environments. And they're cool abilities that people have. It might be a result of magic or technology or whatever. But from all this emerges stories. Usually the archetypes are very strong. They're very clear compared to reality. Very black and white, good versus evil. A lot of them are actually kind of archetypes that have carried through history. Captain Kirk was actually based upon Horatio Hornblower. Darth Vader was inspired by some of the samurais in Kurosawa's films. Gilligan's Island is a great example of this. I'm sure most of you know that Gilligan's Island, the characters were actually based upon the 7 deadly sins. So the professor was pride, Marianne was jealousy, because she was always jealous of Ginger. Gilligan sloth, Ginger lust of course, Mr. Howell greed, Mrs. Howell gluttony, and Skipper anger. Which in some ways makes Gilligan's Island the prequel to the Sandman series by Neil Gaiman. So,